She stood alone in the center of the grand ballroom, and no one looked at her. Not truly. They looked through her, past her, as if she were a piece of the ornate furniture. Isolde of Thornwood had been the Duchess of Ashworth for exactly 1 year, 4 months, and 11 days, and in all that time, her husband had touched her exactly once, to place a ring upon her finger before an altar of indifferent stone. The laughter of the tun swirled around her like perfumed smoke. Ladies in silks of sapphire and emerald cast glances not at her, but at the doorway where the Duke of Ashworth stood. He was a figure carved from winter itself, dark hair, sharp jaw, and eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. Eyes that swept the room with cold authority, landing on everything and everyone except his wife. Isolde's gloved fingers tightened around the stem of her crystal glass, the liquid inside untouched. She had worn the gown he'd never seen, a deep violet velvet, chosen because it brought warmth to her otherwise pale skin. She had spent an hour on her hair. She had practiced a smile that did not tremble, all for nothing. She watched as a young, flaxen-haired beauty approached the Duke, her laughter like the tinkling of silver bells. Lady Clarissa Moore. Everyone knew Clarissa's family desired the match. Everyone knew the Duke had been on the brink of proposing to her before his late father's deathbed decree had forced him into an alliance with the impoverished house of Thornwood instead. Isolde knew it too. She knew she was the obstacle, the unwanted bride, the wall that stood between the powerful Duke and the woman he might have loved. A wave of shame washed over her, cold and nauseating. She set the glass down on a passing tray with a soft, hollow click. The music, a sprightly waltz, seemed to mock her. She could not stay here, not for another moment. To remain was to perform the part of a ghost in her own life. She turned, her heavy skirts swishing around her ankles, and walked toward the terrace. The air outside would be cold. It was late autumn, and the Darrington Estates gardens had long since surrendered their roses. She did not care. She needed to breathe, even if the air was frigid. As she passed the towering glass doors that led to the veranda, her shoulder brushed against the arm of a footman, who immediately flinched away, nearly dropping his tray of champagne coupes. The clatter drew a ripple of attention. More whispers, more glances. "Poor thing," Isolde heard someone murmur, but not in sympathy. It was the tone one used to observe a wounded bird moments before the cat returned. "She doesn't belong, does she?" "The Duke won't even stand near her," another voice replied. "I heard he dines alone in his study, every single night." Isolde's back went rigid, but she kept walking. She pushed through the doors and into the night. The cold hit her like a wave, stealing the breath from her lungs. It felt appropriate. This external cold was a mirror of the one that had taken up residence inside her since her wedding night. She walked to the stone balustrade and gripped it hard, the cold seeping through her gloves. The moon was full, casting pale silver over the skeletal trees of the garden. It was beautiful in a lonely, haunted way. She had tried, she had tried so hard. When she had first arrived at Ashworth Hall, she had been filled with hope. A marriage of convenience could blossom, could it not? Her own parents had begun as strangers. Her father had told her stories of how, after a year of polite distance, he had found his heart beating differently at the sight of her mother's smile. But her husband, Alexander, never gave her the chance. He was polite. He was courteous. He was utterly, devastatingly absent. A letter. She remembered the day she had found it, 3 months ago, in the pocket of his coat while arranging for it to be brushed. It had been from his steward, a Mr. Bellwether, offering condolences on the anniversary of his brother's death. The brother's name had been Julian. Alexander had never once spoken of him. She had asked the housekeeper about it. The housekeeper, a kindly old woman named Mrs. Potts, had gone pale. "That is a wound his grace does not speak of, my lady," she had whispered. "Lord Julian died 8 years ago, a riding accident. They were very close. The Duke blames himself." That was the first crack in Isolde's growing despair. She had seen, for a moment, not a cold, distant stranger, but a man buried under the weight of a grief he could not voice. She had tried to reach him. She had begun to leave fresh flowers in his study. She had instructed the cook to prepare his favorite childhood dessert, a baked apple tart, and serve it to him without mentioning her involvement. She had learned the name of his favorite horse, and ensured the stable hands gave the beast an extra measure of oats. And for a moment she had thought she had seen something shift. One evening, as she'd played the pianoforte in the music room, a haunting melody she had composed herself, she had felt a presence. She had looked up to find him in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He had simply stood there, watching her hands move over the keys, his eyes shadowed. "You play beautifully," he had said, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding beneath a river. It was the first unprompted kindness he had offered her. "Thank you, Your Grace," she had whispered, her heart pounding. He had hesitated, as if on the verge of saying something more. But then he had simply turned and walked away, leaving behind only the ghost of his presence and the lingering scent of leather and wood smoke. That was the moment hope had taken root, a fragile, stubborn seed. But hope, she was learning, was a dangerous thing. It made the fall back into despair all the more painful. A laugh from inside the ballroom filtered through the glass doors, pulling her back to the present. She turned her head to look. Through the amber glow of the ballroom she saw him again. Alexander. He was watching her now. His gaze was a cold, hard line across the distance of the terrace. He was not smiling. He was never smiling. And then, with a flicker of irritation she could not mistake, he turned away, returning his attention to Lady Clarissa. He was not coming for her. He would never come for her. The fragile seed of hope within her withered and died. She made a decision then, a quiet, profound decision in the cold shadows of the Darrington veranda. If he would not love her, she would not beg. She would not spend her life longing for a man who could only see her as an obligation. She would find her own purpose. She would build her own life within the gilded cage of Ashworth Hall. She would learn to live without his love. The next morning, Isolde rose with the cold, gray dawn. The house was quiet, save for the distant sound of servants stirring the fires. She dismissed her lady's maid, Margaret, with a gentle but firm command. She did not want help this morning. She wanted silence. She looked at her reflection in the polished cheval mirror. Her dark hair was still pinned from the night before, though loose strands framed her face. Her eyes, a deep and gentle brown, stared back at her with a mixture of sorrow and a new, dawning resolve. She had been a ghost in that ballroom, haunting the edges of a life she was not invited to fully inhabit. No more. She pulled a simple woolen dress from her wardrobe, one that she might have worn at her family's country estate, and put it on herself. She braided her hair in a simple plait and washed her face in the cold water from the pitcher. The woman in the mirror looked younger and somehow stronger. Her first task was to understand the estate. If she was to be the Duchess of Ashworth, she would be a duchess who did something. She would not simply exist, waiting for a love that was not coming. She would throw her energy into the one thing she could control, the well-being of the people who lived on this land. She summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, to the morning room. The room was bright and cheerful, with pale yellow walls and windows that overlooked a sunken garden. A small fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did not seem to reach Isolde's bones. She sat in a high-backed chair, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. Mrs. Potts entered with a curtsy. She was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with a kind face and sharp, intelligent eyes that had seen much. "Your Grace," she said, "you wished to see me." "Yes, Mrs. Potts, thank you for coming so promptly." Isolde paused, gathering her thoughts. "I have realized that I have been a poor mistress of this house. I have not involved myself in the running of it. That is to change. I wish to know everything. The tenants, the poor in the village, the repairs that are needed, the livelihoods that depend on this estate." Mrs. Potts's eyes widened, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It was the first time anyone in the house had smiled at her with true warmth, Isolde realized. "My lady," Mrs. Potts said, her voice laced with a hint of relief. That is most welcome news. There is much to be done. The previous Duchess, the Duke's mother, was a very hands-on lady, God rest her soul. Since her passing, the Duke has been too consumed with his own burdens to see to everything. For the next hour, Isolde listened. She learned of the tenancies on the verge of disrepair. She learned of a village well that had run foul, causing sickness. She learned of a cottage industry of weavers that was struggling to sell their goods. She listened, and she made a list, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finally returned to her chambers, she felt a shift within herself. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of purpose. It was not love, it was not the warmth of her husband's affection, but it was something. The days began to form a new pattern. Isolde spent her mornings with the steward, Mr. Bellwether, a meticulous and nervous man who was initially skeptical of her interest. But as she asked sharp, intelligent questions and made practical suggestions, his skepticism turned to respect. She visited the tenants herself. She went to the cottages with baskets of food and simple remedies, and she sat with the families, listening to their troubles. She was a duchess who sat on wooden stools and drank weak ale and held crying bobbies. The people of Ashworth Village had never met anyone like her. They began to speak of her in hushed, reverent tones. "The Duchess," they would say, "she has a kind heart, a true heart." She did not do it to gain the Duke's attention. She did it to save herself. And for a time it worked. She was too busy, too exhausted to dwell on her aching loneliness. She was teaching a young girl named Lily to read. She was helping to organize the distribution of winter coats. She was living. It was on a cold, crisp Thursday evening, a full 2 weeks after the Darrington ball, that Alexander Ashworth came to a sudden, jarring stop in the middle of the grand staircase of his own home. He was descending for a late supper when he heard it, a sound of laughter. It was soft, melodic, and it drifted from the morning room. But it was not just one laugh. It was several, the deep, rumbling chuckle of a man, the high-pitched giggle of a child, and then, clear as a bell, the sound of his wife's voice. "No, Lily, you must curl your tongue for the L sound, like this. Lily." It was not the tone she used with him. With him, her voice was always soft, guarded, almost afraid. This voice was warm and open and happy. He frowned, his hand tightening on the smooth banister. He had grown accustomed to the silence, to the quiet, guilt-ridden peace of knowing his wife was avoiding him. It was easier that way. He was not a man built for tenderness. He had learned that lesson in the cruelest possible way. He had seen her change, of course. He was not blind. He had noticed the morning rides she took to the far-flung tenant farms. He had heard the reports from Bellwether, delivered in tones of surprised admiration of her sharp mind and tireless work. He had seen her across the dinner table when she was even present for dinner, and noted the new color in her cheeks, the new light in her eyes, a light that was never, ever directed at him. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. She was his wife. She belonged to him. And yet she was becoming a stranger in his own house, a stranger who was slowly, piece by piece, rebuilding a life that did not include him. He did not want her love. He had made that clear, he thought. He had built his walls so high and so thick that no one could ever scale them again. The last person he had loved with his whole heart had been his brother Julian, and his love, his carelessness, had killed him. He had been the one to dare Julian to jump the flooded ravine. He had been the one to insist on the faster horse. He had been the one to watch, frozen in horror, as Julian's horse had slipped on the slick mud and plunged into the cold, churning water below. The sound of Julian's laugh cut short. The silence that followed, broken only by the roar of the water, the cold, dead weight of his brother's body when they finally pulled him from the stream. These were the memories that lived in Alexander's soul. They were the reason he kept himself distant. If he never loved, he could never lose. He could never be the cause of such pain again. But this quiet, persistent change in Isolde was doing something to him. It was a splinter working its way under his skin, an irritant he could not ignore. He forced himself to continue down the stairs. As he passed the open door of the morning room, he could not help but look. The scene inside was not what he expected. The little girl, Lily, the daughter of a tenant farmer, was curled up on the floor at Isolde's feet, tracing letters on a slate. And sitting across from them in a chair that seemed far too delicate for his large frame was a man, Edward Ashworth, his cousin. Alexander's blood went still. Edward was the charming one, the easy one, the one who had inherited none of the Ashworth title but all of the Ashworth good looks. He was smiling at Isolde in a way that made Alexander's hands curl into fists. It was a smile of easy familiarity, of shared secrets. "So the weavers have agreed to the new pricing," Edward was saying. "Yes," Isolde replied, her face bright with an enthusiasm Alexander had never seen before. "It took some convincing, but Mr. Hale believes we can have the new looms installed before the first snow." "You have quite the gift for diplomacy, cousin," Edward said, his voice warm with admiration. "The Duke is a very fortunate man." The words hung in the air, thick and ironic. Alexander saw the light in Isolde's eyes flicker and die. Her smile faltered. A mask of polite indifference slipped back into place. She looked down at the slate in Lily's hands, her expression now carefully blank. "I am sure His Grace has many more important matters to attend to than the price of wool," she said quietly. Edward, apparently sensing the shift, wisely said nothing more, but his words had been a blow. The Duke is a very fortunate man. The phrase was a mockery, a cruel jest, because everyone in the house knew it was a lie. Alexander was not fortunate, he was cursed, and he was making his wife miserable in the process. A surge of something hot and unpleasant, was it guilt, jealousy, rage, flooded through him. He wanted to stride into the room and snatch the slate from Edward's hand. He wanted to dismiss his cousin and send him back to his own estate. He wanted to tell his wife to stop this charade of happiness. It was not her place to be happy. It was not her place to find friendship with his cousin. But he did none of these things. He was Alexander Ashworth, the Duke of Ashworth. He was in control, always in control. He turned away from the door, his jaw tight, and walked towards his study, the sound of her laughter now a distant, haunting echo. The cold silence between them grew. Isolde stopped trying to coax him into conversation at dinner. She stopped leaving him little notes in his books. She stopped playing the pianoforte in the evenings. The music stopped. The house grew quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the quiet of a hopeful bride. It was the quiet of a woman who had chosen to walk away. One evening, a week after the incident in the morning room, Alexander found himself alone at the dinner table. The long, polished table stretched before him, a vast and empty expanse. Isolde's place setting was untouched. He looked at it for a long moment, his food growing cold on his plate. "Where is the Duchess?" he asked the footman, his voice sharper than he intended. The footman, a young man named Thomas, looked startled. "The Duchess has taken a tray in her chambers, Your Grace. She has a headache." A headache? It was a convenient excuse, a polite lie. She was avoiding him. She had found her own life and she had no room for him in it. He should have felt relief. This was what he wanted, was it not? Distance. Peace. No demands for affection he could not give. But as he sat there, alone in the cavernous dining room, he felt no relief. He felt a gnawing, empty ache. He was alone, utterly, profoundly alone, and it was his own doing. The walls he had built to keep others out had become his prison. Later that night, he found himself wandering the halls of the manor. He did not know where he was going until he found himself standing outside the door of the music room. The grand pianoforte was silent, its lid closed like a sleeping eye. He pushed the door open and walked inside. The air was cold and still. He lit a single candle and sat down on the bench. He did not know how to play, that was Julian's gift, but Isolde could play. She could make the instrument weep and sing. He remembered that first time he had heard her, the night she had played the melody of her own creation. It had been so beautiful, so full of raw, aching emotion that it had stolen the breath from his lungs. He had stood in the doorway, paralyzed, unable to move, unable to speak. He had wanted to tell her how beautiful it was. He had wanted to tell her how her music had cracked something open inside him. But he had only said, "You play beautifully," 4 simple words. And then he had fled, terrified by the feelings she had stirred, terrified that she could reach the part of him he had buried with Julian. He saw now, with a clarity that was physically painful, what a fool he had been. He had a wife who was kind, intelligent, and beautiful, a wife who had offered him her heart on a silver platter, and he had let it fall to the floor. He had watched it shatter. He had not even bothered to pick up the pieces. Now she was gone from him, not physically but spiritually. The light in her eyes was for other people now, for tenants, for servants, for his own cousin. The kindness in her voice was for children and farmers. For him, there was only the cool, polite distance of a woman who had learned to expect nothing and was no longer disappointed. He had lost her. The realization washed over him in the darkness of the music room, and for the first time in 8 years, Alexander Ashworth felt the sting of tears in his eyes. He was not a man who cried, but he was a man who was watching the only good thing in his life slip through his fingers, and he had no idea how to stop it. The next morning he made a decision. He would try. He did not know how to be a loving husband. He had no map for this terrain, but he had to do something. He had to bridge the chasm he had created. He could not continue to live in this cold, silent house with a woman who was his wife in name only. He found her in the library, bent over a ledger with Mr. Bellwether. She was discussing the funding for the new loom project, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up as he entered, and the expression on her face changed. The warmth, the animation, it all vanished, replaced by a guarded, neutral mask. "Your Grace," she said, and Bellwether scrambled to his feet, bowing. "We did not expect you." "Leave us," Alexander said, his voice low. He was looking only at Isolde. Bellwether, sensing the tension, gathered his papers and practically fled from the room. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving them alone. Isolde remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was waiting. For what? For his anger, for his silence. He did not know. "You have been busy," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "There is much to do," she replied evenly. "The tenants have been neglected. And that is your concern." "I am the Duchess of Ashworth," she said, and her voice, though quiet, held a note of steel he had never heard before. "It is my only concern." The words were a deliberate, precise cut. My only concern. She was telling him in her own polite way that he was no longer one of her concerns. He felt the blood drain from his face. "Isolde," he began, but she cut him off. "If you have no objections, Your Grace, I have a great deal of work to do. Unless, of course, you have a specific task for me." She tilted her head, her gaze cool and appraising. She was not angry. She was something far worse. She was indifferent. He opened his mouth to say something, anything. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. He wanted to tell her he had heard her playing and that it had haunted his dreams. He wanted to tell her about Julian, about the crushing weight of his guilt. But the words would not come. The wall he had built was too high. He had hidden behind it for so long that he no longer knew how to tear it down. "No," he said finally, his voice flat. "There is nothing." She nodded once, a single graceful dip of her chin, and returned her attention to the ledger. He had been dismissed by his own wife, in his own home. He turned and left the room, the sting of his own inadequacy burning in his chest. He had failed, again. He walked aimlessly through the halls, his mind a storm of confusion and pain. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly incapable. He was a man who commanded armies, who controlled thousands of acres, who could buy anything he desired. But he could not command the heart of his own wife. He could not buy back her affection. He had thrown it away. The air in the house felt stifling. He needed to escape. He grabbed his coat and hat and went out to the stables. A hard ride would clear his head. He ordered his horse, a massive black stallion named Shadow, to be saddled. He swung into the saddle with a practiced ease and set off at a gallop across the estate grounds. The wind whipped through his hair and the cold air burned his lungs. The powerful muscles of the horse moved beneath him, a familiar, comforting rhythm. But even at a full gallop, he could not outrun the truth. He had made a mess of his marriage. He had kept his wife at arm's length for so long that she had simply stopped caring. And now, when he was finally ready to let her in, she had locked the door. He rode to the edge of the estate, to the wide, rushing river that marked the boundary of his lands, the same river that had taken his brother. The water, swollen with autumn rains, churned and roared. He reined in his horse and dismounted, walking to the edge of the bank. He stood there for a long time, staring at the dark, swirling water. This was the source of his fear, this river and the memory of that terrible day. He had carried the guilt for so long like a lead weight around his neck. He had never spoken of it to anyone, not his father, not his mother, not his friends. He had locked it away deep inside. But he realized now, standing at the edge of the river, that his silence had not protected anyone. It had not brought Julian back. It had only poisoned his own life. It had made him incapable of accepting love, of giving it. It had made him cold, distant, and cruel to the one person who had been willing to try to understand him. And now she had stopped trying, and the pain of her withdrawal was 100 times worse than the pain of his guilt. It was a fresh, living pain. It was the pain of loss, the very pain he had been so desperately trying to avoid. He thought of her face, the way it had been in the library, so calm, so composed, so completely unaffected by his presence. The passion, the hope, the vulnerability, all gone. He had extinguished it. He had taken a vibrant, loving woman and turned her into a shadow of herself. Or perhaps he had not turned her into a shadow. Perhaps he had simply turned her into a woman who no longer needed him. And the thought was unbearable. The thought of living his life without her quiet presence in his home, without the faint scent of her perfume in the halls, without the sound of her laughter, even if that laughter was not for him, was a future he could not face. He had built his life around his isolation, but now the isolation was suffocating him. He had to change, he had to show her, he had to tell her the truth. But how? How could he possibly explain the years of silence, the coldness, the rejection? How could he ask her to love a man who had been so incapable of love? He did not have the answers. He only knew he had to try. The alternative was a lifetime of regret. He returned to the house as the sun was beginning to set, casting long, purple shadows across the lawns. His mind was made up. He would find her. He would sit down with her, and he would tell her everything. About Julian, about his guilt, about his fear, and about the one thing he had finally admitted to himself as he stood by the raging river. He loved her. The realization had come not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating certainty. It had been creeping up on him for months, in the music she played, in the kindness she showed to others, in the strength she displayed in the face of his neglect. He loved her. He, Alexander Ashworth, the cold, unfeeling Duke, was head over heels in love with his own wife. And he had been such a fool that he had only just realized it. He found her in the drawing room, not with Edward, but with Lily. The little girl was perched on a footstool, reading aloud from a book of children's stories. Her voice was slow and halting, but she was managing. Isolde was sitting across from her, a look of focused encouragement on her face. "No, Lily, the O is long in that word. Home, it sounds like ohm," she was saying. "Home," Lily repeated, sounding it out. "Perfect," Isolde said, a warm smile spreading across her face. Alexander stood in the doorway. Watching, the scene was so simple, so domestic, so full of a warmth he had never allowed himself to feel. He took a step into the room. "Isolde," he said, his voice rough. She looked up and the smile on her face faded. She seemed to gather herself, as if preparing for an unpleasant confrontation. "Lily, darling, why don't you go and see if Cook has any of those little cakes left?" she said, her voice gentle. "We can continue our reading tomorrow." Lily, sensing the tension, gave a quick curtsy to the Duke and scampered from the room. The silence in her absence was profound. Isolde remained seated, her gaze fixed on him, her expression unreadable. He took another step closer. "I need to speak with you," he said. "It is long overdue." "Is it?" she asked, her voice flat. "What do you wish to speak of, Your Grace?" "The loom budget, the state of the tenant farms. I am sure Mr. Bellwether could provide a more detailed report." "I do not wish to speak of the estate," he said, his voice low. "I wish to speak of us." Her eyes widened slightly. It was a small reaction, but it was there. "Us," she repeated. "There is no us. There has never been an us. There is the Duke of Ashworth, and there is the woman he was forced to marry. They share a name, but nothing more. That is all there has ever been." Her voice trembled slightly on the last word, but she regained control quickly. The words were a knife to his heart. "That is not true," he said, his own voice strained. He took another step, closing the distance between them. He could see the pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat. She was not as unaffected as she pretended to be. "Do not lie to me, Alexander," she said, and the use of his name, his Christian name, sent a jolt through him. It was not spoken with warmth, but with a kind of weary resignation. "I have been your wife for over a year. I have lived in your house. I have eaten at your table, and you have never once looked at me as anything other than a burden." "That is not true," he repeated, his voice rising with a desperate urgency. "I have looked at you, Isolde. I have seen you. I have seen your kindness, your strength, your intelligence. I have heard the music you play, and it has moved me more than I can say. I have watched you with the tenants, with Lily, and I have been amazed." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Then why," she whispered, her voice cracking, "why the silence? Why the distance? Why did you leave me to drown in my loneliness when all I ever wanted was for you to simply see me, to talk to me?" "Because I was afraid," he said. The admission was raw, torn from him. He was not a man who admitted to fear. He was a duke. He was powerful. He was invincible. But standing before her, he was none of those things. He was just a man, broken and afraid. "Afraid of what?" she asked, her voice soft. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Afraid of losing you," he said. The words were a whisper, heavy with 8 years of buried grief. "I had a brother, Julian. He was younger than me, my best friend. I dared him to jump a ravine on horseback. The horse slipped. He fell into the river. He drowned." Isolde's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with horror and sympathy. "Oh, Alexander," she breathed. "I watched him die," he continued, the words tumbling out now. "I pulled his body from the water, and I blamed myself. I still blame myself. I have carried that guilt every single day for 8 years. I told myself I would never love anyone again, because love meant loss. Love meant pain. If I never loved, I could never hurt like that again." He took another step, closing the remaining distance between them. He was close enough now to see the tears welling in her eyes. "So I built walls," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. "I pushed everyone away. I pushed you away. Because from the moment I first saw you standing at the altar, I knew. I knew you had the power to break through those walls. I knew you could make me feel again, and I was terrified." He reached out and took her hand. It was cold, and it trembled in his grasp. "I have been a fool," he said, "a proud, scared, foolish man, and I have hurt the one person who only ever wanted to heal me. I have pushed you so far away that you no longer need me. And the thought of that, the thought of living without your light, Isolde, it is a fate worse than any guilt I have ever felt." He dropped his gaze, unable to look at her. "I am not asking for your forgiveness," he whispered. "I do not deserve it. I am only asking you to understand, and to know that I am sorry, and that he faltered. The words were there on the tip of his tongue, but he was afraid, afraid that they would not be enough, afraid that it was too late. "What?" she whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "What are you trying to say?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. He let the walls fall. He let her see all of it, the pain, the fear, the regret, and the overwhelming, terrifying love. "I am trying to say that I love you," he confessed, his voice raw and broken. I have loved you for so long that I do not even know when it began. I loved you when you left flowers in my study. I loved you when you played the pianoforte. I loved you when you were kind to me, and I loved you when you finally, rightly, turned away from me. I love you, Isolde, and I am so desperately, profoundly sorry that I was too much of a coward to tell you before it was too late. The tears spilled over and ran down her cheeks. She did not speak. She just stared at him, her eyes wide, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He held her hand, waiting for her verdict. He felt as if he had laid his soul bare before her. He was completely, utterly vulnerable. Finally she spoke. Her voice was small, broken, but it was not with anger. It was with a pain that mirrored his own. I wanted to hate you, she whispered. I tried so hard to hate you. It would have been easier, but I couldn't. Because even through all the silence and the distance I saw you, Alexander. I saw the pain in your eyes. I saw the loneliness you carried. I saw the man you were trying so hard to hide. And I loved him anyway. I loved you, and I thought you could never love me back. She squeezed his hand, her fingers tightening around his. When you watched me play that night, I thought you might finally see me. I thought you might come to me, but you just walked away. And the hope was what hurt the most. I was a coward, he repeated. I walked away because I was afraid of how much I felt. I was afraid that if I stayed, I would fall at your feet and confess everything, and my pride would not allow it. A choked sob escaped her lips. And now, where is your pride now? Gone, he said simply. It is gone. It died the moment I realized you were no longer waiting for me. It died when I saw you smiling at Edward, and I felt a jealousy so violent it consumed me. It died when I realized I would give up everything, my title, my lands, my very soul, for just one more of your smiles to be directed at me. The room was silent, save for the sound of her tears. And then with a sob she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him. She buried her face in his chest, and he felt the warmth of her against him, the solid, real, living warmth of her. He stood frozen for a moment, stunned. Then his arms came up around her, pulling her close. He held her tightly as if afraid she would vanish. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, a scent he had only ever experienced from a distance. Lavender and rain. He had longed for it for so long. I thought I had lost you, he whispered into her hair. I thought I had lost the only chance I had at happiness. I was always here, she cried, her voice muffled against his chest. I was right here, Alexander. I was just waiting for you to find me. They stood there, locked in an embrace that felt like it was mending the broken pieces of both of them. The pain of the past year, the loneliness, the regret, it was all still there, but it was no longer a barrier between them. It was the very foundation on which they were building something new. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her face. He cupped her cheek in his hand, wiping away her tears with his thumb. Her skin was soft and warm beneath his touch. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you, he vowed. I will tell you I love you every single day. I will never let another day pass where you do not know it. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears, but a slow, tentative smile was beginning to form on her lips. You are a very difficult man to love, Alexander Ashworth, she said, her voice shaking but filled with a dawning joy. His own lips curved into a smile. It felt foreign on his face, but good, so good. I know, he said. But I am hoping you will find it in your heart to try. I think I can manage that, she whispered. And for the first time in a very long time, Isolde felt the cold in her heart begin to melt, replaced by a warmth that spread through her like the first light of dawn after a long, dark winter. The days that followed were a revelation. The Duke, it seemed, was a man of his word. He did not stop courting his own wife. He sent her flowers, not anonymously, but with notes written in his own sharp, slanted hand. You are the light in this house. He began to take his meals with her, and instead of the heavy silence, he asked her about her day. He listened to her talk about the loom project, about Lily's reading lessons, about the new well in the village. He listened, truly listened, and offered his own opinions and support. The house began to feel different. The servants walked with a lighter step. Mrs. Potts beamed with satisfaction. The air itself seemed to hum with a quiet happiness. He took her on rides across the estate, not at a breakneck gallop, but at a gentle walk, side by side. He showed her the places that had meant something to him as a child. The old oak tree where he and Julian had built a fort. The quiet bend in the river where he had learned to fish. He spoke of Julian now, not with the gut-wrenching guilt of before, but with a soft, nostalgic fondness. He shared his memories with her, allowing her into the one place he had kept locked away for so long. In turn, Isolde shared more of herself. She played the pianoforte for him again, not the same haunting melody of her loneliness, but new pieces, brighter, more hopeful. He would sit in the chair by the fire, his eyes closed, a look of pure contentment on his face, and just listen. It was, she thought, the most romantic thing in the world. One afternoon, as they were walking through the garden, Isolde's arm linked through his. He stopped. He turned to her, his expression serious. "Isolde," he said, "there is something I must ask you." Her heart gave a nervous flutter. "Yes." "I know I have no right to ask this of you," he said, his voice low, "but I would like for us to be married again." She blinked, confused. "Again?" "A renewal of our vows," he explained. "A small ceremony, just us. I want to stand before you and God and everyone we know and make those vows to you not as a duty but as a choice of my heart. I want to marry you, Isolde, properly this time." Tears pricked at her eyes. It was such a simple request, but it held the weight of all the pain they had overcome. It was a promise of a new beginning. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alexander, I would like that very much." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his storm-gray eyes. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a chaste, tender gesture, but it sent a shiver of joy through her entire being. The ceremony took place a month later in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds. It was not a grand affair. There were no hundreds of guests, no elaborate decorations. The only witnesses were the vicar, Mrs. Potts, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, and a few of the most trusted servants. Edward was there, and for the first time, Isolde saw no jealousy in Alexander's eyes when he looked at him. There was only a quiet peace. Isolde wore a simple gown of ivory silk, and she carried a small bouquet of winter roses, a rare and precious bloom that Alexander had procured from the hothouse. He stood at the altar, looking more handsome than she had ever seen him, his eyes locked on hers. As they exchanged their vows, their voices did not waver. They were not the hesitant promises of two strangers bound by duty, but the fervent, heartfelt declarations of two souls who had found their way to each other through the darkness. When he placed the ring on her finger for the second time, his hand was steady. He looked into her eyes and whispered so that only she could hear, "I love you, with all that I am, with all that I will ever be." And she knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that he meant it. The winter months that followed were the happiest of Isolde's life. The cold outside their windows only made the warmth within their home more precious. They spent their evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, or playing chess, or simply sitting in companionable silence. Alexander was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. He was a man who had learned to laugh again. His love for her was a constant, reassuring presence, not a grand, flamboyant performance, but a quiet, steady devotion that filled every corner of her world. She still worked for the tenants, but now Alexander worked beside her. Together, they planned for the spring planting, for the improvements to the village, for the school that they would establish for the children of the estate. They were partners, a team, and in their shared purpose, their love only grew deeper. The music returned to Ashworth Hall. The sound of Isolde's pianoforte filled the halls every evening. But now it was not the sound of lonely longing. It was the sound of a heart that had found its home. And as the seasons turned and the first green shoots of spring began to appear, the Duke and his Duchess looked out over their lands, their hands clasped together, their hearts full of a hard-won, enduring peace. The silence between them was no longer a void of pain, but a space filled with an unspoken, absolute, and forever love.